Chapter 21 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The arrival of this letter, coming after a week of silence, and after she had had a chance to think, moved Jennie deeply. What did she want to do? What ought she to do? How did she truly feel about this man? Did she sincerely wish to answer his letter? If she did so, what should she say? Heretofore, all her movements, even the one in which she had sought to sacrifice herself for the sake of Bass and Columbus, had not seemed to involve anyone but herself. Now there seemed to be others to consider, her family, above all her child. The little Vesta was now 18 months of age. She was an interesting child, her large blue eyes and light hair giving promise of a comeliness which would closely approximate that of her mother, while her mental traits indicated a clear and intelligent mind. Mrs. Gerhardt had become very fond of her. Gerhardt had unbended so gradually that his interest was not even yet clearly discernible, but he had a distinct feeling of kindliness toward her. And this readjustment of her father's attitude had aroused in Jennie an ardent desire to so conduct herself that no pain should ever come to him again. Any new folly on her part would not only be base ingratitude to her father, but would tend to injure the prospects of her little one. Her life was a failure, she fancied, but Vesta's was a thing apart. She must do nothing to spoil it. She wondered whether it would not be better to write Lester and explain everything. She had told him that she did not wish to do wrong. Suppose she went on to inform him that she had a child, and beg him to leave her in peace. Would he obey her? She doubted it. Did she really want him to take her at her word? The need of making this confession was a painful thing to Jennie. It caused her to hesitate to start a letter in which she tried to explain, and then tear it up. Finally, fate intervened in the sudden homecoming of her father, who had been seriously injured by an accident at the glass works in Youngstown, where he worked. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the latter part of August when a letter came from Gerhardt, but instead of the customary fatherly communication written in German and enclosing the regular weekly remittance of $5, there was only a brief note written by another hand and explaining that the day before Gerhardt had received a severe burn on both hands, due to the accidental overturning of a dipper of molten glass. The letter added that he would be home the next morning. "What do you think of that?" exclaimed William, his mouth wide open. "Poor papa," said Veronica, tears welling up in her eyes. Mrs. Gerhardt sat down, clasped her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor. Now what to do? She nervously exclaimed. The possibility that Gerhardt was disabled for life opened long vistas of difficulties which she had not the courage to contemplate. Bass came home at 6:30 and Jennie at 8. The former heard the news with an astonished face. "Gee, that's tough, isn't it?" he exclaimed. "Did the letter say how bad he was hurt?" "No," replied Mrs. Gerhardt. "Well, I wouldn't worry about it," said Bass easily. "It won't do any good. We'll get along somehow. I wouldn't worry like that if I were you." The truth was he wouldn't, because his nature was wholly different. Life did not rest heavily upon his shoulders. His brain was not large enough to grasp the significance and weigh the results of things. "I know," said Mrs. Gerhardt, endeavoring to recover herself. "I can't help it, though. To think that just when we were getting along fairly well this new calamity should be added. It seems sometimes as if we're under a curse. We have so much bad luck." When Jennie came her mother turned to her instinctively. Here was her one stay. "What's the matter, Ma?" asked Jennie as she opened the door and observed her mother's face. "What have you been crying about?" Mrs. Gerhardt looked at her and then turned half away. "Pa had his hands burned," put in Bass solemnly. "He'll be home tomorrow." Jennie turned and stared at him. "His hands burned?" she exclaimed. "Yes," said Bass. "How did it happen?" "A pot of glass was turned over." Jennie looked at her mother, and her eyes dimmed with tears. Instinctively she ran to her and put her arms around her. "Now don't you cry, Ma," she said, barely able to control herself. "Don't you worry. I know how you feel, but we'll get along. Don't cry now." Then her own lips lost their evenness, and she struggled long before she could pluck up courage to contemplate this new disaster. And now, without volition upon her part, there leaped into her consciousness a new and subtly persistent thought. What about Lester's offer of assistance now? What about his declaration of love? Somehow it came back to her, his affection, his personality, his desire to help her, his sympathy, so like that which Brander had shown when Bass was in jail. Was she doomed to a second sacrifice? Did it really make any difference? Wasn't her life a failure already? She thought this over as she looked at her mother sitting there so silent, haggard, and distraught. What a pity, she thought, that her mother must always suffer. Wasn't it a shame that she could never have any real happiness? "I wouldn't feel so badly," she said after a time. "Maybe Papa isn't burned so badly as we think. Did the letter say he'd be home in the morning?" "Yes," said Mrs. Gerhardt, recovering herself. They talked more quietly from now on, and gradually, as the details were exhausted, a kind of dumb peace settled down upon the household. "One of us ought to go to the train to meet him in the morning," said Jennie to Bass. "I will. I guess Miss Bracebridge won't mind." "No," said Bass gloomily. "You mustn't. I can go." He was sour at this new fling of fate, and he looked his feelings. He stalked off gloomily to his room and shut himself in. Jennie and her mother saw the others off to bed, and then sat out in the kitchen talking. "I don't see what's to become of us now," said Mrs. Gerhardt at last, completely overcome by the financial complications which this new calamity had brought about. She looked so weak and helpless that Jennie could hardly contain herself. "Don't worry, Mama dear," she said softly, a peculiar resolve coming into her heart. The world was wide. There was comfort and ease in it, scattered by others with a lavish hand. Surely, surely misfortune could not press so sharply but that they could live. She sat down with her mother, the difficulties of the future seeming to approach with audible and ghastly steps. "What do you suppose will become of us now?" repeated her mother, who saw how her fanciful conception of this Cleveland home had crumbled before her eyes. "Why," said Jennie, who saw clearly and knew what could be done, "it will be all right. I wouldn't worry about it. Something will happen. We'll get something." She realized as she sat there that fate had shifted the burden of the situation to her. She must sacrifice herself. There was no other way. Bass met his father at the railway station in the morning. He looked very pale and seemed to have suffered a great deal. His cheeks were slightly sunken, and his bony profile appeared rather gaunt. His hands were heavily bandaged, and altogether he presented such a picture of distress that many people stopped to look at him on the way home from the station. "By chops," he said to Bass, "that was a burn I got. I thought once I couldn't stand the pain any longer. Such pain I had, such pain. By chops, I will never forget it." He related just how the accident had occurred, and said that he did not know whether he would ever be able to use his hands again. The thumb of his right hand and the first two fingers of the left had been burned to the bone. The latter had been amputated at the first joint. The thumb he might save, but his hands would be in danger of being stiff. "By chops," he added, "just at the time when I needed the money most. Too bad, too bad." When they reached the house and Mrs. Gerhardt opened the door, the old mill worker, conscious of her voiceless sympathy, began to cry. Mrs. Gerhardt sobbed also. Even Bass lost control of himself for a moment or two, but quickly recovered. The other children wept until Bass called a halt on all of them. "Don't cry now," he said cheeringly. "What's the use of crying? It isn't so bad as all that. You'll be all right again. We can get along." Bass's words had a soothing effect temporarily, and now that her husband was home, Mrs. Gerhardt recovered her composure. Though his hands were bandaged, the mere fact that he could walk and was not otherwise injured was some consolation. He might recover the use of his hands and be able to undertake light work again. Anyway, they would hope for the best. When Jennie came home that night she wanted to run to her father and lay the treasury of her services and affection at his feet, but she trembled lest he might be as cold to her as formerly. Gerhardt, too, was troubled. Never had he completely recovered from the shame which his daughter had brought upon him. Although he wanted to be kindly, his feelings were so tangled that he hardly knew what to say or do. "Papa," said Jennie, approaching him timidly. Gerhardt looked confused and tried to say something natural, but it was unavailing. The thought of his helplessness, the knowledge of her sorrow, and his own responsiveness to her affection, it was all too much for him. He broke down again and cried helplessly. "Forgive me, Papa," she pleaded. "I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry." He did not attempt to look at her, but in the swirl of feeling that their meeting created, he thought that he could forgive, and he did. "I have prayed," he said brokenly. "It is all right." When he recovered himself he felt ashamed of his emotion, but a new relationship of sympathy and of understanding had been established. From that time, although there was always a great reserve between them, Gerhardt tried not to ignore her completely, and she endeavored to show him the simple affection of a daughter, just as in the old days. But while the household was again at peace, there were other cares and burdens to be faced. How were they to get along now with $5 taken from the weekly budget, and with the cost of Gerhardt's presence added? Bass might have contributed more of his weekly earnings, but he did not feel called upon to do it, and so the small sum of $9 weekly must meet as best it could the current expenses of rent, food, and coal, to say nothing of incidentals, which now began to press very heavily. Gerhardt had to go to the doctor to have his hands dressed daily. George needed a new pair of shoes. Either more money must come from some source, or the family must beg for credit and suffer the old tortures of want. The situation crystallized the half-formed resolve in Jennie's mind. Lester's letter had been left unanswered. The day was drawing near. Should she write? He would help them. Had he not tried to force money on her? She finally decided that it was her duty to avail herself of this proffered assistance. She sat down and wrote him a brief note. She would meet him as he had requested, but he would please not come to the house. She mailed the letter and then waited, with mingled feelings of trepidation and thrilling expectancy, the arrival of the fateful day. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The fatal Friday came, and Jennie stood face to face with this new and overwhelming complication in her modest scheme of existence. There was really no alternative, she thought. Her own life was a failure. Why go on fighting? If she could make her family happy, if she could give Vesta a good education, if she could conceal the true nature of this older story and keep Vesta in the background, perhaps. Well, rich men had married poor girls before this, and Lester was very kind. He certainly liked her. At 7 o'clock she went to Mrs. Bracebridge's. At noon she excused herself on the pretext of some work for her mother, and left the house for the hotel. Lester, leaving Cincinnati a few days earlier than he had expected, had failed to receive her reply. He arrived at Cleveland feeling sadly out of tune with the world. He had a lingering hope that a letter from Jennie might be awaiting him at the hotel, but there was no word from her. He was a man not easily wrought up, but tonight he felt depressed, and so went gloomily up to his room and changed his linen. After supper he proceeded to drown his dissatisfaction in a game of billiards with some friends, from whom he did not part until he had taken very much more than his usual amount of alcoholic stimulant. The next morning he arose with a vague idea of abandoning the whole affair, but as the hours elapsed and the time of his appointment drew near, he decided that it might not be unwise to give her one last chance. She might come. Accordingly, while it still lacked a quarter of an hour of the time, he went down into the parlor. Great was his delight when he beheld her sitting in a chair and waiting, the outcome of her acquiescence. He walked briskly up, a satisfied, gratified smile on his face. "So you did come after all," he said, gazing at her with the look of one who has lost and recovered a prize. "What do you mean by not writing me? I thought from the way you neglected me that you had made up your mind not to come at all." "I did write," she replied. "Where?" "To the address you gave me. I wrote 3 days ago." "That explains it. It came too late. You should have written me before. How have you been?" "Oh, all right," she replied. "You don't look it," he said. "You look worried. What's the trouble, Jennie? Nothing's gone wrong out at your house, has there?" It was a fortuitous question. He hardly knew why he had asked it. Yet it opened the door to what she wanted to say. "My father's sick," she replied. "What happened to him?" "He burned his hands at the glassworks. We've been terribly worried. It looks as though he would not be able to use them any more." She paused, looking the distress she felt, and he saw plainly that she was facing a crisis. "That's too bad," he said. "That certainly is. When did this happen?" "Oh, almost 3 weeks ago now." "It certainly is bad. Come in to lunch, though. I want to talk with you. I've been wanting to get a better understanding of your family affairs since I left." He led the way into the dining room and selected a secluded table. He tried to divert her mind by asking her to order the luncheon, but she was too worried and too shy to do so, and he had to make out the menu by himself. Then he turned to her with a cheering air. "Now, Jennie," he said, "I want you to tell me all about your family. I got a little something of it last time, but I want to get it straight. Your father, you said, was a glass blower by trade. Now he can't work any more at that. That's obvious." "Yes," she said. "How many other children are there?" "6." "Are you the oldest?" "No, my brother Sebastian is. He's 22." "And what does he do?" "He's a clerk in a cigar store." "Do you know how much he makes?" "I think it's $12," she replied thoughtfully. "And the other children?" "Martha and Veronica don't do anything yet. They're too young. My brother George works at Wilson's. He's a cash boy. He gets $3.50." "And how much do you make?" "I make 4." He stopped, figuring up mentally just what they had to live on. "How much rent do you pay?" he continued. $12. "How old is your mother?" "She's nearly 50 now." He turned a fork in his hands back and forth. He was thinking earnestly. "To tell you the honest truth, I fancied it was something like that, Jennie," he said. "I've been thinking about you a lot. Now I know. There's only one answer to your problem, and it isn't such a bad one if you'll only believe me." He paused for an inquiry, but she made none. Her mind was running on her own difficulties. "Don't you want to know?" he inquired. "Yes," she answered mechanically. "It's me," he replied. "You have to let me help you. I wanted to last time. Now you have to. Do you hear?" "I thought I wouldn't," she said simply. "I knew what you thought," he replied. That's all over now. I'm going to tend to that family of yours, and I'll do it right now while I think of it." He drew out his purse and extracted several $10 and $20 bills, $250 in all. "I want you to take this," he said. "It's just the beginning. I will see that your family is provided for from now on. Here, give me your hand." "Oh, no," she said, "not so much. Don't give me all that." "Yes," he replied. "Don't argue. Here, give me your hand." She put it out in answer to the summons of his eyes, and he shut her fingers on the money, pressing them gently at the same time. "I want you to have it, sweet. I love you, little girl. I'm not going to see you suffer, nor anyone belonging to you." Her eyes looked a dumb thankfulness, and she bit her lips. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to," he replied. "The thanks are all the other way, believe me." He paused and looked at her, the beauty of her face holding him. She looked at the table, wondering what would come next. "How would you like to leave what you're doing and stay at home?" he asked. "That would give you your freedom daytimes." "I couldn't do that," she replied. "Papa wouldn't allow it. He knows I ought to work." "That's true enough," he said. "But there's so little in what you're doing. Good heavens, $4 a week! I would be glad to give you 50 times that sum if I thought there was any way in which you could use it." He idly thrummed the cloth with his fingers. "I couldn't," she said. "I hardly know how to use this. They'll suspect. I'll have to tell Mama." From the way she said it, he judged there must be some bond of sympathy between her and her mother which would permit of a confidence such as this. He was by no means a hard man, and the thought touched him. But he would not relinquish his purpose. "There's only one thing to be done as far as I can see," he went on very gently. "You're not suited for the kind of work you're doing. You're too refined. I object to it. Give it up and come with me down to New York. I'll take good care of you. I love you and want you. As far as your family is concerned, you won't have to worry about them any more. You can take a nice home for them and furnish it in any style you please. Wouldn't you like that?" He paused, and Jennie's thoughts reverted quickly to her mother, her dear mother. All her life Mrs. Gerhardt had been talking of this very thing, a nice home. If they could just have a larger house with good furniture and a yard filled with trees, how happy she would be. In such a home she would be free of the care of rent, the discomfort of poor furniture, the wretchedness of poverty. She would be so happy. She hesitated there while his keen eye followed her in spirit, and he saw what a power he had set in motion. It had been a happy inspiration, the suggestion of a decent home for the family. He waited a few minutes longer and then said, "Well, wouldn't you better let me do that?" "It would be very nice," she said, "but it can't be done now. I couldn't leave home. Papa would want to know all about where I was going. I wouldn't know what to say." "Why couldn't you pretend that you're going down to New York with Mrs. Bracebridge?" he suggested. "There couldn't be any objection to that, could there?" "Not if they didn't find out," she said, her eyes opening in amazement. "But if they should—" "They won't," he replied calmly. "They're not watching Mrs. Bracebridge's affairs. Plenty of mistresses take their maids on long trips. Why not simply tell them you're invited to go, have to go, and then go?" "Do you think I could?" she inquired. "Certainly," he replied. "What is there peculiar about that?" She thought it over, and the plan did seem feasible. Then she looked at this man and realized the relationship with him meant possible motherhood for her again. The tragedy of giving birth to a child. Ah, she could not go through that a second time, at least under the same conditions. She could not bring herself to tell him about Vesta, but she must voice this insurmountable objection. She said, formulating the first word of her sentence and then stopping. "Yes," he said. "I what?" "I—" She paused again. He loved her shy ways, her sweet, hesitating lips. "What is it, Jennie?" he asked helpfully. "You're so delicious. Can't you tell me?" Her hand was on the table. He reached over and laid his strong brown one on top of it. "I couldn't have a baby," she said finally, and looked down. He gazed at her, and the charm of her frankness, her innate decency under conditions so anomalous, her simple, unaffected recognition of the primal facts of life lifted her to a plane in his esteem which she had not occupied until that moment. "You're a great girl, Jennie," he said. "You're wonderful. But don't worry about that. It can be arranged. You don't need to have a child unless you want to, and I don't want you to." He saw the question written in her wondering, shamed face. "It's so," he said. "You believe me, don't you? You think I know, don't you?" "Yes," she faltered. "Well, I do. But anyway, I wouldn't let any trouble come to you. I'll take you away. Besides, I don't want any children. There wouldn't be any satisfaction in that proposition for me at this time. I'd rather wait. But there won't be. Don't worry." "Yes," she said faintly. Not for worlds could she have met his eyes. "Look here, Jennie," he said after a time. "You care for me, don't you? You don't think I'd sit here and plead with you if I didn't care for you? I'm crazy about you, and that's the literal truth. You're like wine to me. I want you to come with me. I want you to do it quickly. I know how difficult this family business is, but you can arrange it. Come with me down to New York. We'll work out something later. I'll meet your family. We'll pretend a courtship, anything you like. Only come now." "You don't mean right away, do you?" she asked, startled. "Yes, tomorrow if possible. Monday, sure. You can arrange it. Why, if Miss Bracebridge asked you, you'd go fast enough and no one would think anything about it. Isn't that so?" "Yes," she admitted slowly. "Well, then, why not now?" "It's always so much harder to work out a falsehood," she replied thoughtfully. "I know it. But you can come, won't you?" "Won't you wait a little while?" she pleaded. "It's so very sudden. I'm afraid." "Not a day, sweet, that I can help. Can't you see how I feel? Look in my eyes, will you?" "Yes," she replied sorrowfully, and yet with a strange thrill of affection. "I will." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The business of arranging for the sudden departure was really not so difficult as it first appeared. Jennie proposed to tell her mother the whole truth, and there was nothing to say to her father except that she was going with Mrs. Bracebridge at the latter's request. He might question her, but he really could not doubt. Before going home that afternoon, she accompanied Lester to a department store, where she was fitted out with a trunk, a suitcase, and a traveling suit and hat. Lester was very proud of his prize. "When we get to New York, I'm going to get you some real things," he told her. "I'm going to show you what you can be made to look like." He had all the purchased articles packed in the trunk and sent to his hotel. Then he arranged to have Jennie come there and dress Monday for the trip, which began in the afternoon. When she came home, Mrs. Gerhardt, who was in the kitchen, received her with her usual affectionate greeting. "Have you been working very hard?" she asked. "You look tired." "No," she said, "I'm not tired. It isn't that. I just don't feel good." "What's the trouble?" "Oh, I have to tell you something, Mama. It's so hard." She paused, looking inquiringly at her mother, and then away. "Why, what is it?" asked her mother nervously. So many things had happened in the past that she was always on the alert for some new calamity. "You haven't lost your place, have you?" "No," replied Jennie, with an effort to maintain her mental poise. "But I'm going to leave it." "No!" exclaimed her mother. "Why?" "I'm going to New York." Her mother's eyes opened widely. "Why? When did you decide to do that?" she inquired. "Today." "You don't mean it." "Yes, I do, Mama. Listen, I've got something I want to tell you. You know how poor we are. There isn't any way we can make things come out right. I have found someone who wants to help us. He says he loves me, and he wants me to go to New York with him Monday. I've decided to go." "Oh, Jennie!" exclaimed her mother. "Surely not. You wouldn't do anything like that after all that's happened. Think of your father." "I've thought it all out," went on Jennie firmly. "It's really for the best. He's a good man. I know he is. He has lots of money. He wants me to go with him, and I'd better go. He will take a new house for us when we come back and help us to get along. No one will ever have me as a wife. You know that. It might as well be this way. He loves me, and I love him. Why shouldn't I go?" "Does he know about Vesta?" asked her mother cautiously. "No," said Jennie guiltily. "I thought I'd better not tell him about her. She oughtn't to be brought into it if I can help it." "I'm afraid you're storing up trouble for yourself, Jennie," said her mother. "Don't you think he is sure to find it out sometime?" "I thought maybe that she could be kept here," suggested Jennie, "until she's old enough to go to school. Then maybe I could send her somewhere." "She might," assented her mother. "But don't you think it would be better to tell him now? He won't think any worse of you." "It isn't that. It's her," said Jennie passionately. "I don't want her to be brought into it." Her mother shook her head. "Where did you meet him?" she inquired. "At Mrs. Bracebridge's." "How long ago?" "Oh, it's been almost 2 months now." "And you never said anything about him," protested Mrs. Gerhardt reproachfully. "I didn't know that he cared for me this way," said Jennie defensively. "Why didn't you wait and let him come out here first?" asked her mother. "It will make things so much easier. You can't go and not have your father find out." "I thought I'd say I was going with Mrs. Bracebridge. Papa can't object to my going with her." "No," agreed her mother thoughtfully. The two looked at each other in silence. Mrs. Gerhardt, with her imaginative nature, endeavored to formulate some picture of this new and wonderful personality that had come into Jennie's life. He was wealthy. He wanted to take Jennie. He wanted to give them a good home. What a story! "And he gave me this," put in Jennie, who, with some instinctive psychic faculty, had been following her mother's mood. She opened her dress at the neck and took out the $250. She placed the money in her mother's hands. The latter stared at it wide-eyed. Here was the relief for all her woes: food, clothes, rent, coal, all done up in one small package of green and yellow bills. If there were plenty of money in the house, Gerhardt needn't worry about his burned hands. George and Martha and Veronica could be clothed in comfort and made happy. Jennie could dress better. There would be a future education for Vesta. "Do you think he might ever want to marry you?" asked her mother finally. "I don't know," replied Jennie. "He might. I know he loves me." "Well," said her mother after a long pause, "if you're going to tell your father, you'd better do it right away. He'll think it strange as it is." Jennie realized that she had won. Her mother had acquiesced from sheer force of circumstances. She was sorry, but somehow it seemed to be for the best. "I'll help you out with it," her mother had concluded with a little sigh. The difficulty of telling this lie was very great for Mrs. Gerhardt, but she went through the falsehood with a seeming nonchalance which allayed Gerhardt's suspicions. The children were also told, and when, after the general discussion, Jennie repeated the falsehood to her father, it seemed natural enough. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" he inquired. "About 2 or 3 weeks," she replied. "That's a nice trip," he said. "I came through New York in 1844. It was a small place then compared to what it is now." Secretly he was pleased that Jennie should have this fine chance. Her employer must like her. When Monday came, Jennie bade her parents good by and left early, going straight to the Dornton where Lester awaited her. "So you came," he said gaily, greeting her as she entered the ladies' parlor. "Yes," she said simply. "You are my niece," he went on. "I have engaged H room for you near mine. I'll call for the key, and you go dress. When you're ready, I'll have the trunk sent to the depot. The train leaves at 1 o'clock." She went to her room and dressed, while he fidgeted about, read, smoked, and finally knocked at her door. She replied by opening to him, fully clad. "You look charming," he said with a smile. She looked down, for she was nervous and distraught. The whole process of planning, lying, nerving herself to carry out her part had been hard on her. She looked tired and worried. "Not grieving, are you?" he asked, seeing how things stood. "No," she replied. "Come now, sweet, you mustn't feel this way. It's coming out all right." He took her in his arms and kissed her, and they strolled down the hall. He was astonished to see how well she looked in even these simple clothes, the best she had ever had. They reached the depot after a short carriage ride. The accommodations had been arranged for beforehand, and Kane had allowed just enough time to make the train. When they settled themselves in a Pullman stateroom, it was with a keen sense of satisfaction on his part. Life looked rosy. Jennie was beside him. He had succeeded in what he had started out to do. So might it always be. As the train rolled out of the depot and the long reaches of the fields succeeded, Jennie studied them wistfully. There were the forests, leafless and bare, the wide brown fields, wet with the rains of winter, the low farmhouses sitting amid flat stretches of prairie, their low roofs making them look as if they were hugging the ground. The train roared past little hamlets with cottages of white and yellow and drab, their roofs blackened by frost and rain. Jennie noted one in particular which seemed to recall the old neighborhood where they used to live at Columbus. She put her handkerchief to her eyes and began silently to cry. "I hope you're not crying, are you, Jennie?" said Lester, looking up suddenly from the letter he had been reading. "Come, come," he went on, as he saw a faint tremor shaking her. "This won't do. You have to do better than this. You'll never get along if you act that way." She made no reply, and the depth of her silent grief filled him with strange sympathies. "Don't cry," he continued soothingly. "Everything will be all right. I told you that. You needn't worry about anything." Jennie made a great effort to recover herself and began to dry her eyes. "You don't want to give way like that," he continued. "It doesn't do you any good. I know how you feel about leaving home, but tears won't help it any. It isn't as if you were going away for good, you know. Besides, you'll be going back shortly. You care for me, don't you, sweet? I'm something." "Yes," she said, and managed to smile back at him. Lester returned to his correspondence, and Jennie fell to thinking of Vesta. It troubled her to realize that she was keeping the secret from one who was already very dear to her. She knew that she ought to tell Lester about the child, but she shrank from the painful necessity. Perhaps later on she might find the courage to do it. "I'll have to tell him something," she thought with a sudden upwelling of feeling as regarded the seriousness of this duty. "If I don't do it soon, and I should go and live with him, and he should find it out, he would never forgive me. He might turn me out, and then where would I go? I have no home now. What would I do with Vesta?" She turned to contemplate him, a premonitory wave of terror sweeping over her. But she only saw that imposing and comfort-loving soul quietly reading his letters, his smoothly shaved red cheek and comfortable head and body looking anything but militant or like an avenging nemesis. She was just withdrawing her gaze when he looked up. "Well, have you washed all your sins away?" he inquired merrily. She smiled faintly at the allusion. The touch of fact in it made it slightly piquant. "I expect so," she replied. He turned to some other topic while she looked out the window, the realization that one impulse to tell him had proved unavailing dwelling in her mind. "I'll have to do it shortly," she thought, and consoled herself with the idea that she would surely find courage before long. Their arrival in New York the next day raised the important question in Lester's mind as to where he should stop. New York was a very large place, and he was not in much danger of encountering people who would know him. But he thought it just as well not to take chances. Accordingly, he had the cabman drive them to one of the more exclusive apartment hotels, where he engaged a suite of rooms, and they settled themselves for a stay of 2 or 3 weeks. This atmosphere into which Jennie was now plunged was so wonderful, so illuminating, that she could scarcely believe that this was the same world that she had inhabited before. Kane was no lover of vulgar display. The appointments with which he surrounded himself were always simple and elegant. He knew at a glance what Jennie needed, and bought for her with discrimination and care. And Jennie, a woman, took a keen pleasure in the handsome gowns and pretty fripperies that he lavished upon her. Could this really be Jennie Gerhardt, the washerwoman's daughter? She asked herself as she gazed in her mirror at the figure of a girl clad in blue velvet with yellow French lace at her throat and upon her arms. Could these be her feet clad in soft, shapely shoes at $10 a pair? These her hands adorned with flashing jewels? What wonderful good fortune she was enjoying! And Lester had promised that her mother would share in it. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thought. The dear mother, how she loved her! It was Lester's pleasure in these days to see what he could do to make her look like someone truly worthy of him. He exercised his most careful judgment, and the result surprised even himself. People turned in the halls, in the dining rooms, and on the street to gaze at Jennie. "A stunning woman that man has with him," was a frequent comment. Despite her altered state, Jennie did not lose her judgment of life or her sense of perspective or proportion. She felt as though life were tentatively loaning her something which would be taken away after a time. There was no petty vanity in her bosom. Lester realized this as he watched her. "You're a big woman in your way," he said. "You'll amount to something. Life hasn't given you much of a deal up to now." He wondered how he could justify this new relationship to his family, should they chance to hear about it. If he should decide to take a home in Chicago or St. Louis—there was such a thought running in his mind—could he maintain it secretly? Did he want to? He was half persuaded that he really, truly loved her. As the time drew near for their return, he began to counsel her as to her future course of action. "You ought to find some way of introducing me as an acquaintance to your father," he said. "It will ease matters up. I think I'll call. Then if you tell him you're going to marry me he'll think nothing of it." Jennie thought of Vesta and trembled inwardly. But perhaps her father could be induced to remain silent. Lester had made the wise suggestion that she should retain the clothes she had worn in Cleveland in order that she might wear them home when she reached there. "There won't be any trouble about this other stuff," he said. "I'll have it cared for until we make some other arrangement." It was all very simple and easy. He was a master strategist. Jennie had written her mother almost daily since she had been East. She had enclosed little separate notes to be read by Mrs. Gerhardt only. In one she explained Lester's desire to call, and urged her mother to prepare the way by telling her father that she had met someone who liked her. She spoke of the difficulty concerning Vesta, and her mother at once began to plan a campaign to have Gerhardt hold his peace. There must be no hitch now. Jennie must be given an opportunity to better herself. When she returned there was great rejoicing. Of course she could not go back to her work, but Mrs. Gerhardt explained that Mrs. Bracebridge had given Jennie a few weeks' vacation in order that she might look for something better, something at which she could make more money. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The problem of the Gerhardt family and its relationship to himself comparatively settled, Kane betook himself to Cincinnati and to his business duties. He was heartily interested in the immense plant which occupied 2 whole blocks in the outskirts of the city, and its conduct and development was as much a problem and a pleasure to him as to either his father or his brother. He liked to feel that he was a vital part of this great and growing industry. When he saw freight cars going by on the railroads labeled the Kane Manufacturing Company, Cincinnati, or chanced to notice displays of the company's products in the windows of carriage sales companies in the different cities, he was conscious of a warm glow of satisfaction. It was something to be a factor in an institution so stable, so distinguished, so honestly worthwhile. This was all very well, but now Kane was entering upon a new phase of his personal existence. In a word, there was Jennie. He was conscious as he rode towards his home city that he was entering on a relationship which might involve disagreeable consequences. He was a little afraid of his father's attitude. Above all, there was his brother, Robert. Robert was cold and conventional in character, an excellent business man, irreproachable in both his public and in his private life, never overstepping the strict boundaries of legal righteousness. He was neither warm-hearted nor generous. In fact, he would turn any trick which could be speciously, or at best necessitously, recommended to his conscience. How he reasoned, Lester did not know. He could not follow the ramifications of a logic which could combine hard business tactics with moral rigidity, but somehow his brother managed to do it. He's got a Scotch Presbyterian conscience mixed with an Asiatic perception of the main chance, Lester once told somebody, and he had the situation accurately measured. Nevertheless, he could not rout his brother from his position nor defy him, for he had the public conscience with him. He was in line with convention practically and perhaps sophisticatedly. The 2 brothers were outwardly friendly. Inwardly they were far apart. Robert liked Lester well enough personally, but he did not trust his financial judgment, and temperamentally they did not agree as to how life and its affairs should be conducted. Lester had a secret contempt for his brother's chill, persistent chase of the almighty dollar. Robert was sure that Lester's easygoing ways were reprehensible and bound to create trouble sooner or later. In the business they did not quarrel much, but there was not so much chance with the old gentleman still in charge. But there were certain minor difficulties constantly cropping up which showed which way the wind blew. Lester was for building up trade through friendly relationship, concessions, personal contact, and favors. Robert was for pulling everything tight, cutting down the cost of production and offering such financial inducements as would throttle competition. The old manufacturer always did his best to pour oil on these troubled waters, but he foresaw an eventual clash. One or the other would have to get out, or perhaps both. If only you 2 boys could agree, he used to say. Another thing which disturbed Lester was his father's attitude on the subject of marriage. Lester's marriage, to be specific. Archibald Kane had never ceased to insist on the fact that Lester ought to get married, and that he was making a big mistake in putting it off. All the other children, save Louise, were safely married. Why not his favorite son? It was doing him injury, morally, socially, commercially, that he was sure of. The world expects it of a man in your position, his father had argued from time to time. It makes for social solidity and prestige. You ought to pick out a good woman and raise a family. Where will you be when you get to my time of life if you haven't any children, any home?" "Well, if the right woman came along," said Lester, "I suppose I'd marry her. But she hasn't come along. What do you want me to do? Take anybody?" "No, not anybody, of course. But there are a lot of good women. You can surely find some one if you try. There's that Pace girl. What about her? You used to like her. I wouldn't drift on this way, Lester. It can't come to any good." His son would only smile. "There, father, let it go now. I'll come around sometime, no doubt. I've got to be thirsty when I'm led to water." The old gentleman gave over time and again. It was a sore point with him. He wanted his son to settle down and be a real man of affairs. The fact that such a situation as this might militate against any permanent arrangement with Jennie was obvious even to Lester at this time. He thought out his course of action carefully. Of course, he would not give Jennie up, whatever the possible consequences. But he must be cautious. He must take no unnecessary risk. Could he bring her to Cincinnati? What a scandal if it were ever found out! Could he install her in a nice home somewhere near the city? The family would probably eventually suspect something. Could he take her along on his numerous business journeys? This first one to New York had been successful. Would it always be so? He turned the question over in his mind. The very difficulty gave it zest. Perhaps St. Louis or Pittsburgh or Chicago would be best after all. He went to these places frequently, and particularly to Chicago. He decided finally that it should be Chicago if he could arrange it. He could always make an excuse to run up there, and it was only a night's ride. Yes, Chicago was best. The very size and activity of the city made concealment easy. After 2 weeks' stay at Cincinnati, Lester wrote Jennie that he was coming to Cleveland soon, and she answered that she thought it would be all right for him to call and see her. Her father had been told about him. She felt it unwise to stay about the house, and so had secured a position in a store at $4 a week. He smiled as he thought of her working, and yet the decency and energy of it appealed to him. "She's all right," he said. "She's the best I've come across yet." He ran up to Cleveland the following Saturday, and calling at her place of business, he made an appointment to see her that evening. He was anxious that his introduction as her beau should be gotten over with as quickly as possible. When he did call, the shabbiness of the house and the manifest poverty of the family rather disgusted him, but somehow Jennie seemed as sweet to him as ever. Gerhardt came in the front room after he had been there a few minutes and shook hands with him, as did also Mrs. Gerhardt, but Lester paid little attention to them. The old German appeared to him to be merely commonplace, the sort of man who was hired by hundreds in common capacities in his father's factory. After some desultory conversation, Lester suggested to Jennie that they should go for a drive. Jennie put on her hat, and together they departed. As a matter of fact, they went to an apartment which he had hired for the storage of her clothes. When she returned at 8 in the evening, the family considered it nothing amiss. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A month later, Jennie was able to announce that Lester intended to marry her. His visits had of course paved the way for this, and it seemed natural enough. Only Gerhardt seemed a little doubtful. He did not know just how this might be. Perhaps it was all right. Lester seemed a fine enough man in all conscience, and really, after Brander, why not? If a United States Senator could fall in love with Jennie, why not a businessman? There was just one thing, the child. Has she told him about Vesta? He asked his wife. "No," said Mrs. Gerhardt, "not yet." "Not yet, not yet. Always something underhanded. Do you think he wants her if he knows? That's what comes from such conduct in the first place. Now she has to slip around like a thief. The child cannot even have an honest name." Gerhardt went back to his newspaper reading and brooding. His life seemed a complete failure to him. He was only waiting to get well enough to hunt up another job as a watchman. He wanted to get out of this mess of deception and dishonesty. A week or two later Jennie confided to her mother that Lester had written her to join him in Chicago. He was not feeling well and could not come to Cleveland. The two women explained to Gerhardt that Jennie was going away to be married to Mr. Kane. Gerhardt flared up at this, and his suspicions were again aroused, but he could do nothing but grumble over the situation. It would lead to no good end, of that he was sure. When the day came for Jennie's departure, she had to go without saying farewell to her father. He was out looking for work until late in the afternoon, and before he returned she had been obliged to leave for the station. "I will write a note to him when I get there," she said. She kissed her baby over and over. "Lester will take a better house for us soon," she went on hopefully. "He wants us to move." The night train bore her to Chicago. The old life had ended, and the new one had begun. The curious fact should be recorded here that, although Lester's generosity had relieved the stress upon the family finances, the children and Gerhardt were actually none the wiser. It was easy for Mrs. Gerhardt to deceive her husband as to the purchase of necessities, and she had not as yet indulged in any of the fancies which an enlarged purse permitted. Fear deterred her. But after Jennie had been in Chicago for a few days, she wrote to her mother saying that Lester wanted them to take a new home. This letter was shown to Gerhardt, who had been merely biding her return to make a scene. He frowned, but somehow it seemed an evidence of regularity. If he had not married her, why should he want to help them? Perhaps Jennie was well married after all. Perhaps she really had been lifted to a high station in life and was now able to help the family. Gerhardt almost concluded to forgive her everything once and for all. The end of it was that a new house was decided upon, and Jennie returned to Cleveland to help her mother move. Together they searched the streets for a nice, quiet neighborhood, and finally found one. A house of 9 rooms with a yard which rented for $30 was secured and suitably furnished. There were comfortable fittings for the dining room and sitting room, a handsome parlor set, and bedroom sets complete for each room. The kitchen was supplied with every convenience, and there was even a bathroom, a luxury the Gerhardts had never enjoyed before. Altogether the house was attractive, though plain, and Jennie was happy to know that her family could be comfortable in it. When the time came for the actual moving, Mrs. Gerhardt was fairly beside herself with joy, for was this not the realization of her dreams? All through the long years of her life she had been waiting, and now it had come. A new house, new furniture, plenty of room, things finer than she had ever imagined. Think of it! Her eyes shone as she looked at the new beds and tables and bureaus and whatnots. "Dear, dear, isn't this nice?" she exclaimed. "Isn't it beautiful?" Jennie smiled and tried to pretend satisfaction without emotion, but there were tears in her eyes. She was so glad for her mother's sake. She could have kissed Lester's feet for his goodness to her family. The day the furniture was moved in, Mrs. Gerhardt, Martha, and Veronica were on hand to clean and arrange things. At the sight of the large rooms and pretty yard, bare enough in winter, but giving promise of a delightful greenness in spring, and the array of new furniture standing about in excelsior, the whole family fell into a fever of delight. Such beauty, such spaciousness! George rubbed his feet over the new carpets, and Bass examined the quality of the furniture critically. "Swell," was his comment. Mrs. Gerhardt roved to and fro like a person in a dream. She could not believe that these bright bedrooms, this beautiful parlor, this handsome dining room, were actually hers. Gerhardt came last of all. Although he tried hard not to show it, he, too, could scarcely refrain from enthusiastic comment. The sight of an opal-globed chandelier over the dining room table was the finishing touch. "Gas yet," he said. He looked grimly around under his shaggy eyebrows at the new carpets under his feet, the long oak extension table covered with a white cloth and set with new dishes, at the pictures on the walls, the bright, clean kitchen. He shook his head. "By chops, it's fine," he said. "It's very nice. Yes, it's very nice. We want to be careful now not to break anything. It's so easy to scratch things up, and then it's all over." Yes, even Gerhardt was satisfied. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It would be useless to chronicle the events of the 3 years that followed, events and experiences by which the family grew from an abject condition of want to a state of comparative self-reliance, based, of course, on the obvious prosperity of Jennie and the generosity, through her, of her distant husband. Lester was seen now and then, a significant figure, visiting Cleveland, and sometimes coming out to the house where he occupied with Jennie the 2 best rooms of the second floor. There were hurried trips on her part in answer to telegraph messages, to Chicago, to St. Louis, to New York. One of his favorite pastimes was to engage quarters at the great resorts, Hot Springs, Mount Clemens, Saratoga, and for a period of a week or 2 at a stretch enjoy the luxury of living with Jennie as his wife. There were other times when he would pass through Cleveland only for the privilege of seeing her for a day. All the time he was aware that he was throwing on her the real burden of a rather difficult situation, but he did not see how he could remedy it at this time. He was not sure as yet that he really wanted to. They were getting along fairly well. The attitude of the Gerhardt family toward this condition of affairs was peculiar. At first, in spite of the irregularity of it, it seemed natural enough. Jennie said she was married. No one had seen her marriage certificate, but she said so, and she seemed to carry herself with the air of one who holds that relationship. Still, she never went to Cincinnati, where his family lived, and none of his relatives ever came near her. Then, too, his attitude, in spite of the money, which had first blinded them, was peculiar. He really did not carry himself like a married man. He was so indifferent. There were weeks in which she appeared to receive only perfunctory notes. There were times when she would go away for a few days to meet him. Then there were the long periods in which she absented herself, the only worthwhile testimony toward a real relationship, and that, in a way, unnatural. Bass, who had grown to be a young man of 25, with some business judgment and a desire to get out in the world, was suspicious. He had come to have a pretty keen knowledge of life, and intuitively he felt that things were not right. George, 19, who had gained a slight foothold in a wallpaper factory and was looking forward to a career in that field, was also restless. He felt that something was wrong. Martha, 17, was still in school, as were William and Veronica. Each was offered an opportunity to study indefinitely, but there was unrest with life. They knew about Jennie's child. The neighbors were obviously drawing conclusions for themselves. They had few friends. Gerhardt himself finally concluded that there was something wrong, but he had let himself into this situation and was not in much of a position now to raise an argument. He wanted to ask her at times, proposed to make her do better if he could, but the worst had already been done. It depended on the man now, he knew that. Things were gradually nearing a state where a general upheaval would have taken place had not life stepped in with one of its fortuitous solutions. Mrs. Gerhardt's health failed. Although stout and formerly of a fairly active disposition, she had of late years become decidedly sedentary in her habits and grown weak, which, coupled with a mind naturally given to worry, and weighed upon as it had been by a number of serious and disturbing ills, seemed now to culminate in a slow but very certain case of systemic poisoning. She became decidedly sluggish in her motions, wearied more quickly at the few tasks left for her to do, and finally complained to Jennie that it was very hard for her to climb stairs. "I'm not feeling well," she said. "I think I'm going to be sick." Jennie now took alarm and proposed to take her to some nearby watering place, but Mrs. Gerhardt wouldn't go. "I don't think it would do any good," she said. She sat about or went driving with her daughter, but the fading autumn scenery depressed her. "I don't like to get sick in the fall," she said. "The leaves coming down make me think I am never going to get well." "Oh, Ma, how you talk," said Jennie, but she felt frightened nevertheless. How much the average home depends upon the mother was seen when it was feared the end was near. Bass, who had thought of getting married and getting out of this atmosphere, abandoned the idea temporarily. Gerhardt, shocked and greatly depressed, hung about like one expectant of and greatly awed by the possibility of disaster. Jennie, too inexperienced in death to feel that she could possibly lose her mother, felt as if somehow her living depended on her. Hoping in spite of all opposing circumstances, she hung about, a white figure of patience, waiting and serving. The end came one morning after a month of illness and several days of unconsciousness, during which silence reigned in the house and all the family went about on tiptoe. Mrs. Gerhardt passed away, with her dying gaze fastened on Jennie's face for the last few minutes of consciousness that life vouchsafed her. Jennie stared into her eyes with a yearning horror. Oh, Mama," she cried. "Oh, no, no." Gerhardt came running in from the yard, and throwing himself down by the bedside, wrung his bony hands in anguish. "I should have gone first," he cried. "I should have gone first." The death of Mrs. Gerhardt hastened the final breaking up of the family. Bass was bent on getting married at once, having had a girl in town for some time. Martha, whose views of life had broadened and hardened, was anxious to get out also. She felt that a sort of stigma attached to the home, to herself in fact, so long as she remained there. Martha looked to the public schools as a source of income. She was going to be a teacher. Gerhardt alone scarcely knew which way to turn. He was again at work as a night watchman. Jennie found him crying one day alone in the kitchen and immediately burst into tears herself. "Now, Papa," she pleaded, "it isn't as bad as that. You will always have a home. You know that. As long as I have anything, you can come with me." "No, no," he protested. He did not really want to go with her. "It isn't that," he continued. "My whole life comes to nothing." It was some little time before Bass, George, and Martha finally left, but one by one they got out, leaving Jennie, her father, Veronica, and William, and one other, Jennie's child. Of course Lester knew nothing of Vesta's parentage, and curiously enough, he had never seen the little girl. During the short periods in which he deigned to visit the house, 2 or 3 days at most, Mrs. Gerhardt took good care that Vesta was kept in the background. There was a playroom on the top floor and also a bedroom there, and concealment was easy. Lester rarely left his rooms. He even had his meals served to him in what might have been called the living room of the suite. He was not at all inquisitive or anxious to meet any one of the other members of the family. He was perfectly willing to shake hands with them or to exchange a few perfunctory words, but perfunctory words only. It was generally understood that the child must not appear, and so it did not. There is an inexplicable sympathy between old age and childhood, an affinity which is as lovely as it is pathetic. During that first year in Laurie Street, when no one was looking, Gerhardt often carried Vesta about on his shoulders and pinched her soft red cheeks. When she got old enough to walk, he it was who, with a towel fastened securely under her arms, led her patiently around the room until she was able to take a few steps of her own accord. When she actually reached the point where she could walk, he was the one who coaxed her to the effort, shyly, grimly, but always lovingly. By some strange leading of fate, this stigma on his family's honor, this blotch on conventional morality, had twined its helpless baby fingers about the tendons of his heart. He loved this little outcast ardently, hopefully. She was the one bright ray in a narrow, gloomy life, and Gerhardt early took upon himself the responsibility of her education in religious matters. Was it not he who had insisted that the infant should be baptized? "Say, 'Our Father,'" he used to demand of the lisping infant when he had her alone with him. "Our Father" was her vowel-like interpretation of his words. "Who art in heaven." "Who are in heaven," repeated the child. "Why do you teach her so early?" pleaded Mrs. Gerhardt, overhearing the little one's struggles with stubborn consonants and vowels. "Because I want she should learn the Christian faith," returned Gerhardt determinedly. "She ought to know her prayers. If she don't begin now, she never will know them." Mrs. Gerhardt smiled. Many of her husband's religious idiosyncrasies were amusing to her. At the same time, she liked to see this sympathetic interest he was taking in the child's upbringing. If he were only not so hard, so narrow at times, he made himself a torment to himself and to everyone else. On the earliest bright morning of returning spring, he was wont to take her for her first little journey in the world. "Come now," he would say, "we will go for a little walk." "Walk?" chirped Vesta. "Yes, walk," echoed Gerhardt. Mrs. Gerhardt would fasten on one of her little hoods, for in these days Jennie kept Vesta's wardrobe beautifully replete. Taking her by the hand, Gerhardt would issue forth, satisfied to drag first one foot and then the other in order to accommodate his gait to her toddling steps. One beautiful May day, when Vesta was 4 years old, they started on one of their walks. Everywhere nature was budding and burgeoning, the birds twittering their arrival from the south, the insects making the best of their brief span of life. Sparrows chirped in the road, robins strutted upon the grass, bluebirds built in the eaves of the cottages. Gerhardt took a keen delight in pointing out the wonders of nature to Vesta, and she was quick to respond. Every new sight and sound interested her. "Ooh, ooh!" exclaimed Vesta, catching sight of a low, flashing touch of red as a robin lighted upon a twig near by. Her hand was up, and her eyes were wide open. "Yes," said Gerhardt, as happy as if he himself had but newly discovered this marvelous creature. "Robin, bird, robin. Say robin." "Wobbin," said Vesta. "Yes, robin," he answered. "It's going to look for a worm now. We'll see if we cannot find its nest. I think I saw a nest in one of these trees." He plodded peacefully on, seeking to rediscover an old abandoned nest that he had observed on a former walk. "Here it is," he said at last, coming to a small and leafless tree in which a winter-beaten remnant of a home was still clinging. "Here, come now, see." He lifted the baby up at arm's length. "See," said Gerhardt, indicating the wisp of dead grasses with his free hand. "Nest. That is a bird's nest. See?" "Ooh," repeated Vesta, imitating his pointing finger with one of her own. "Nests. Ooh." "Yes," said Gerhardt, putting her down. "That was a wren's nest. They have all gone now. They will not come any more." Still further they plodded, he unfolding the simple facts of life, she wondering with the wide wonder of a child. When they had gone a block or two he turned slowly about as if the end of the world had been reached. "We must be going back," he said. And so she had come to her 5th year, growing in sweetness, intelligence, and vivacity. Gerhardt was fascinated by the questions she asked, the puzzles she pronounced. "Such a girl," he would exclaim to his wife. "What is it she doesn't want to know? Where is God? What does he do? Where does he keep his feet? She asks me. I got to laugh sometimes." From rising in the morning to dress her to laying her down at night after she had said her prayers, she came to be the chief solace and comfort of his days. Without Vesta, Gerhardt would have found his life hard indeed to bear. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For 3 years now Lester had been happy in the companionship of Jennie. Irregular as the connection might be in the eyes of the church and of society, it had brought him peace and comfort, and he was perfectly satisfied with the outcome of the experiment. His interest in the social affairs of Cincinnati was now practically nil, and he had consistently refused to consider any matrimonial proposition which had himself as the object. He looked on his father's business organization as offering a real chance for himself if he could get control of it. But he saw no way of doing so. Robert's interests were always in the way, and if anything, the two brothers were farther apart than ever in their ideas and aims. Lester had thought once or twice of entering some other line of business or allying himself with another carriage company, but he did not feel that he could conscientiously do this. Lester had his salary, $15,000 a year as secretary and treasurer of the company. His brother was vice president, and about $5,000 from some outside investments. He had not been so lucky or so shrewd in speculation as Robert had been, aside from the principal which yielded his $5,000. He had nothing. Robert, on the other hand, was unquestionably worth between $300,000 and $400,000, in addition to his future interest in the business, which both brothers shrewdly suspected would be divided somewhat in their favor. Robert and Lester would get a fourth each, they thought, their sisters a sixth. It seemed natural that Kane Sr. should take this view, seeing that the brothers were actually in control and doing the work. Still, there was no certainty. The old gentleman might do anything or nothing. The probabilities were that he would be very fair and liberal. At the same time, Robert was obviously beating Lester in the game of life. What did Lester intend to do about it? There comes a time in every thinking man's life when he pauses and takes stock of his condition, when he asks himself how it fares with his individuality as a whole, mental, moral, physical, material. This time comes after the first heedless flights of youth have passed, when the initiative and more powerful efforts have been made, and he begins to feel the uncertainty of results and final values which attaches itself to everything. There is a deadening thought of uselessness which creeps into many men's minds, the thought which has been best expressed by the preacher in Ecclesiastes. Yet Lester strove to be philosophical. "What difference does it make," he used to say to himself, "whether I live at the White House or here at home or at the Grand Pacific?" But in the very question was the implication that there were achievements in life which he had failed to realize in his own career. The White House represented the rise and success of a great public character. His home and the Grand Pacific were what had come to him without effort. He decided for the time being, it was about the period of the death of Jennie's mother, that he would make some effort to rehabilitate himself. He would cut out idling. These numerous trips with Jennie had cost him considerable time. He would make some outside investments. If his brother could find avenues of financial profit, so could he. He would endeavor to assert his authority. He would try to make himself of more importance in the business, rather than let Robert gradually absorb everything. Should he forsake Jennie? That thought also came to him. She had no claim on him. She could make no protest. Somehow he did not see how it could be done. It seemed cruel, useless above all. Though he disliked to admit it, it would be uncomfortable for himself. He liked her, loved her perhaps, in a selfish way. He didn't see how he could desert her very well. Just at this time he had a really serious difference with Robert. His brother wanted to sever relations with an old and well-established paint company in New York, which had manufactured paints especially for the house, and invest in a new concern in Chicago, which was growing and had a promising future. Lester, knowing the members of the Eastern firm, their reliability, their long and friendly relations with the house, was in opposition. His father at first seemed to agree with Lester, but Robert argued out the question in his cold, logical way, his blue eyes fixed uncompromisingly upon his brother's face. "We can't go on forever," he said, "standing by old friends just because father here has dealt with them or you like them. We must have a change. The business must be stiffened up. We're going to have more and stronger competition." "It's just as father feels about it," said Lester at last. "I have no deep feeling in the matter. It won't hurt me one way or the other. You say the house is going to profit eventually. I've stated the arguments on the other side." "I'm inclined to think Robert is right," said Archibald Kane calmly. "Most of the things he has suggested so far have worked out." Lester colored. "Well, we won't have any more discussion about it then," he said. He rose and strolled out of the office. The shock of this defeat, coming at a time when he was considering pulling himself together, depressed Lester considerably. It wasn't much, but it was a straw. And his father's remark about his brother's business acumen was even more irritating. He was beginning to wonder whether his father would discriminate in any way in the distribution of the property. Had he heard anything about his entanglement with Jennie? Had he resented the long vacations he had taken from business? It did not appear to Lester that he could be justly chargeable with either incapacity or indifference, so far as the company was concerned. He had done his work well. He was still the investigator of propositions put up to the house, the student of contracts, the trusted adviser of his father and mother. But he was being worsted. Where would it end? He thought about this, but could reach no conclusion. Later that same year Robert came forward with a plan for reorganization in the executive department of the business. He proposed that they should build an immense exhibition and storage warehouse on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, and transfer a portion of their completed stock there. Chicago was more central than Cincinnati. Buyers from the West and country merchants could be more easily reached and dealt with there. It would be a big advertisement for the house, a magnificent evidence of its standing and prosperity. Kane Sr. and Lester immediately approved of this. Both saw its advantages. Robert suggested that Lester should undertake the construction of the new building. It would probably be advisable for him to reside in Chicago a part of the time. The idea appealed to Lester, even though it took him away from Cincinnati largely, if not entirely. It was dignified and not unrepresentative of his standing in the company. He could live in Chicago, and he could have Jennie with him. The scheme he had for taking an apartment could now be arranged without difficulty. He voted yes. Robert smiled. "I'm sure we'll get good results from this all around," he said. As construction work was soon to begin, Lester decided to move to Chicago immediately. He sent word for Jennie to meet him, and together They selected an apartment on the North Side, a very comfortable suite of rooms on a side street near the lake, and he had it fitted up to suit his taste. He figured that living in Chicago he could pose as a bachelor. He would never need to invite his friends to his rooms. There were his offices, where he could always be found, his clubs and the hotels. To his way of thinking, the arrangement was practically ideal. Of course, Jennie's departure from Cleveland brought the affairs of the Gerhardt family to a climax. Probably the home would be broken up, but Gerhardt himself took the matter philosophically. He was an old man, and it did not matter much where he lived. Bass, Martha, and George were already taking care of themselves. Veronica and William were still in school, but some provision could be made for boarding them with a neighbor. The one real concern of Jennie and Gerhardt was Vesta. It was Gerhardt's natural thought that Jennie must take the child with her. What else should a mother do? "Have you told him yet?" he asked her, when the day of her contemplated departure had been set. "No, but I'm going to soon," she assured him. "Always soon," he said. He shook his head. His throat swelled. "It's too bad," he went on. "It's a great sin. God will punish you, I'm afraid. The child needs someone. I'm getting old, otherwise I would keep her. There is no one here all day now to look after her right, as she should be." Again he shook his head. "I know," said Jennie weakly. "I'm going to fix it now. I'm going to have her live with me soon. I won't neglect her. You know that." "But the child's name," he insisted. "She should have a name. Soon, in another year, she goes to school. People will want to know who she is. It can't go on forever like this." Jennie understood well enough that it couldn't. She was crazy about her baby. The heaviest cross she had to bear was the constant separations and the silence she was obliged to maintain about Vesta's very existence. It did seem unfair to the child, and yet Jennie did not see clearly how she could have acted otherwise. Vesta had good clothes, everything she needed. She was at least comfortable. Jennie hoped to give her a good education. If only she had told the truth to Lester in the first place. Now it was almost too late, and yet she felt that she had acted for the best. Finally, she decided to find some good woman or family in Chicago who would take charge of Vesta for a consideration. In a Swedish colony to the west of LaSalle Avenue, she came across an old lady who seemed to embody all the virtues she required: cleanliness, simplicity, honesty. She was a widow, doing work by the day, but she was glad to make an arrangement by which she should give her whole time to Vesta. The latter was to go to kindergarten when a suitable one should be found. She was to have toys and kindly attention, and Mrs. Olsen was to inform Jennie of any change in the child's health. Jennie proposed to call every day, and she thought that sometimes, when Lester was out of town, Vesta might be brought to the apartment. She had had her with her at Cleveland, and he had never found out anything. The arrangements completed, Jennie returned at the first opportunity to Cleveland to take Vesta away. Gerhardt, who had been brooding over his approaching loss, appeared most solicitous about her future. "She should grow up to be a fine girl," he said. "You should give her a good education. She is so smart." He spoke of the advisability of sending her to a Lutheran school and church, but Jennie was not so sure of that. Time and association with Lester had led her to think that perhaps the public school was better than any private institution. She had no particular objection to the church, but she no longer depended upon its teachings as a guide in the affairs of life. Why should she? The next day it was necessary for Jennie to return to Chicago. Vesta, excited and eager, was made ready for the journey. Gerhardt had been wandering about, restless as a lost spirit, while the process of dressing was going on. Now that the hour had actually struck, he was doing his best to control his feelings. He could see that the 5-year-old child had no conception of what it meant to him. She was happy and self-interested. chattering about the ride in the train. "Be a good little girl," he said, lifting her up and kissing her. "See that you study your catechism and say your prayers. And you won't forget the grandpa, what?" He tried to go on, but his voice failed him. Jennie, whose heart ached for her father, choked back her emotion. "There," she said. "If I had thought you were going to act like that—" She stopped. "Go," said Gerhardt manfully. "Go. It is best this way." And he stood solemnly by as they went out the door. Then he turned back to his favorite haunt, the kitchen, and stood there staring at the floor. One by one they were leaving him. Mrs. Gerhardt, Bass, Martha, Jennie, Vesta. He clasped his hands together after his old-time fashion and shook his head again and again. "So it is, so it is," he repeated. "They all leave me. All my life goes to pieces." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. During the 3 years in which Jennie and Lester had been associated, there had grown up between them a strong feeling of mutual sympathy and understanding. Lester truly loved her in his own way. It was a strong, self-satisfying, determined kind of way, based solidly on a big natural foundation, but rising to a plane of genuine spiritual affinity. The yielding sweetness of her character both attracted and held him. She was true and good and womanly to the very center of her being. He had learned to trust her, to depend upon her, and the feeling had but deepened with the passing of the years. On her part, Jennie had sincerely, deeply, truly learned to love this man. At first, when he had swept her off her feet, overawed her soul, and used her necessity as a chain wherewith to bind her to him, she was a little doubtful, a little afraid of him, although she had always liked him. Now, however, by living with him, by knowing him better, by watching his moods, she had come to love him. He was so big, so vocal, so handsome. His point of view and opinions of anything and everything were so positive. His pet motto, "Hew to the line, let the chips fall where they may," had clung in her brain as something immensely characteristic. Apparently, he was not afraid of anything, God, man, or devil. He used to look at her, holding her chin between the thumb and fingers of his big brown hand, and say, "You're sweet, all right, but you need courage and defiance. You haven't enough of those things." And her eyes would meet his in dumb appeal. "Never mind," he would add, "you have other things." And then he would kiss her. One of the most appealing things to Lester was the simple way in which she tried to avoid exposure of her various social and educational shortcomings. She could not write very well, and once he found a list of words he had used written out on a piece of paper with the meanings opposite. He smiled, but he liked her better for it. Another time, in the Southern Hotel in St. Louis, he watched her pretending a loss of appetite because she thought that her lack of table manners was being observed by nearby diners. She could not always be sure of the right forks and knives, and the strange-looking dishes bothered her. How did one eat asparagus and artichokes? "Why don't you eat something?" he asked good-naturedly. "You're hungry, aren't you?" "Not very." "You must be. Listen, Jennie, I know what it is. You mustn't feel that way. Your manners are all right. I wouldn't bring you here if they weren't. Your instincts are all right. Don't be uneasy. I'd tell you quick enough when there was anything wrong." His brown eyes held a friendly gleam. She smiled gratefully. "I do feel a little nervous at times," she admitted. "Don't," he repeated. "You're all right. Don't worry. I'll show you." And he did. By degrees Jennie grew into an understanding of the usages and customs of comfortable existence. All that the Gerhardt family had ever had were the bare necessities of life. Now she was surrounded with whatever she wanted: trunks, clothes, toilet articles, the whole varied equipment of comfort. And while she liked it all, it did not upset her sense of proportion and her sense of the fitness of things. There was no element of vanity in her, only a sense of joy and privilege and opportunity. She was grateful to Lester for all that he had done and was doing for her. If only she could hold him always. The details of getting Vesta established once adjusted, Jennie settled down into the routine of home life. Lester, busy about his multitudinous affairs, was in and out. He had a suite of rooms reserved for himself at the Grand Pacific, which was then the exclusive hotel in Chicago, and this was his ostensible residence. His luncheon and evening appointments were kept at the Union Club. An early patron of the telephone, he had had one installed in the apartment so that he could reach Jennie quickly and at any time. He was home 2 or 3 nights a week, sometimes oftener. He insisted at first on Jennie having a girl of general housework, but acquiesced in the more sensible arrangement which she suggested later of letting someone come in to do the cleaning. She liked to work around her own home. Her natural industry and love of order prompted this feeling. Lester liked his breakfast served promptly at 8 in the morning. He wanted dinner served nicely at 7. Silverware, cut glass, imported china, all the little luxuries of life appealed to him. He kept his trunks and wardrobe at the apartment. During the first few months everything went smoothly. He was in the habit of taking Jennie to the theater now and then, and if he chanced to run across an acquaintance he always introduced her as Miss Gerhardt. When he registered her as his wife it was usually under an assumed name. Where there was no danger of detection he did not mind using his own signature. Thus far there had been no difficulty or unpleasantness of any kind. The trouble with his situation was that it was crisscrossed with danger and consequent worry, which the deception in regard to Vesta had entailed, as well as with Jennie's natural anxiety about her father and the disorganized home. Jennie feared, as Veronica hinted, that she and William would go to live with Martha, who was installed in a boarding house in Cleveland, and that Gerhardt would be left alone. He was such a pathetic figure to her, with his injured hands and his one ability, that of being a watchman, that she was hurt to think of his being left alone. Would he come to her? She knew that he would not, feeling as he did at present. Would Lester have him? She was not sure of that. If he came, Vesta would have to be accounted for. So she worried. The situation in regard to Vesta was really complicated. Owing to the feeling that she was doing her daughter a great injustice, Jennie was particularly sensitive in regard to her, anxious to do 1,000 things to make up for the one great duty that she could not perform. She daily paid a visit to the home of Mrs. Olsen, always taking with her toys, candy, or whatever came into her mind as being likely to interest and please the child. She liked to sit with Vesta and tell her stories of fairy and giant, which kept the little girl wide-eyed. At last she went so far as to bring her to the apartment when Lester was away visiting his parents, and she soon found it possible, during his several absences, to do this regularly. After that, as time went on, she began to know his habits. She became more bold, although bold is scarcely the word to use in connection with Jennie. She became venturesome, much as a mouse might. She would risk Vesta's presence on the assurance of even short absences, 2 or 3 days. She even got into the habit of keeping a few of Vesta's toys at the apartment, so that she could have something to play with when she came. During these several visits from her child, Jennie could not but realize the lovely thing life would be were she only an honored wife and a happy mother. Vesta was a most observant little girl. She could, by her innocent, childish questions, give 100 turns to the dagger of self-reproach which was already planted deeply in Jennie's heart. "Can I come live with you?" was one of her simplest and most frequently repeated questions. Jennie would reply that Mama could not have her just yet, but that very soon now, just as soon as she possibly could, Vesta should come to stay always. "Don't you know just when?" Vesta would ask. "No, dearest, not just when. Very soon now. You won't mind waiting a little while? Don't you like Mrs. Olsen?" "Yes," replied Vesta, "but then she ain't got any nice things now. She's just got old things." And Jennie, stricken to the heart, would take Vesta to the toy shop and load her down with a new assortment of playthings. Of course, Lester was not in the least suspicious. His observation of things relating to the home were rather casual. He went about his work and his pleasure, believing Jennie to be the soul of sincerity and good-natured service, and it never occurred to him that there was anything underhanded in her actions. Once he did come home sick in the afternoon and found her absent, an absence which endured from 2 o'clock to 5. He was a little irritated and grumbled on her return, but his annoyance was as nothing to her astonishment and fright when she found him there. She blanched at the thought of his suspecting something, and explained as best she could. She had gone to see her washerwoman. She was slow about her marketing. She didn't dream he was there. She was sorry, too, that her absence had lost her an opportunity to serve him. It showed her what a mess she was likely to make of it all. It happened that about 3 weeks after the above occurrence, Lester had occasion to return to Cincinnati for a week. And during this time Jennie again brought Vesta to the flat. For 4 days there was the happiest goings-on between the mother and child. Nothing would have come of this little reunion had it not been for an oversight on Jennie's part, the far-reaching effect of which she could only afterward regret. This was the leaving of a little toy lamb under the large leather divan in the front room, where Lester was wont to lie and smoke. A little bell held by a thread of blue ribbon was fastened about its neck, and this tinkled feebly whenever it was shaken. Vesta, with the unaccountable freakishness of children, had deliberately dropped it behind the divan, an action which Jennie did not notice at the time. When she gathered up the various playthings after Vesta's departure, she overlooked it entirely, and there it rested, its innocent eyes still staring upon the sunlit regions of Toyland, when Lester returned. That same evening, when he was lying on the divan, quietly enjoying his cigar and his newspaper, he chanced to drop the former fully lighted. Wishing to recover it before it should do any damage, he leaned over and looked under the divan. The cigar was not in sight, so he rose and pulled the lounge out, a move which revealed to him the little lamb still standing where Vesta had dropped it. He picked it up, turning it over and over and wondering how it had come there. A lamb! It must belong to some neighbor's child in whom Jennie had taken an interest, he thought. He would have to go and tease her about this. Accordingly, he held the toy jovially before him, and coming out into the dining room, where Jennie was working at the sideboard, he exclaimed in a mock solemn voice, "Where did this come from?" Jennie, who was totally unconscious of the existence of this evidence of her duplicity, turned and was instantly possessed with the idea that he had suspected all and was about to visit his just wrath upon her. Instantly the blood flamed in her cheeks and as quickly left them. Why," she stuttered, "it's a little toy I bought." "I see it is," he returned genially, her guilty tremor not escaping his observation, but having at the same time no explicable significance to him. "It's frisking around a mighty lone sheepfold." He touched the little bell at its throat while Jennie stood there, unable to speak. It tinkled feebly, and then he looked at her again. His manner was so humorous that she could tell he suspected nothing. However, It was almost impossible for her to recover her self-possession. "What's ailing you?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "You look as though a lamb was a terrible shock to you." "I forgot to take it out from there, that was all," she went on blindly. "It looks as though it has been played with enough," he added more seriously, and then, seeing that the discussion was evidently painful to her, he dropped it. The lamb had not furnished him the amusement that he had expected. Lester went back into the front room, stretched himself out, and thought it over. Why was she nervous? What was there about a toy to make her grow pale? Surely there was no harm in her harboring some youngster of the neighborhood when she was alone, having it come in and play. Why should she be so nervous? He thought it over, but could come to no conclusion. Nothing more was said about the incident of the toy lamb. Time might have wholly effaced the impression from Lester's memory had nothing else intervened to arouse his suspicions. But a mishap of any kind seems invariably to be linked with others, which follow close upon its heels. One evening, when Lester happened to be lingering about the flat later than usual, the doorbell rang, and Jennie being busy in the kitchen, Lester went himself to open the door. He was greeted by a middle-aged lady who frowned very nervously upon him and inquired in broken Swedish accents for Jennie. "Wait a moment," said Lester, and stepping to the rear door, he called her. Jennie came, and seeing who the visitor was, she stepped nervously out in the hall and closed the door after her. The action instantly struck Lester as suspicious. He frowned and determined to inquire thoroughly into the matter. A moment later Jennie reappeared. Her face was white, and her fingers seemed to be nervously seeking something to seize upon. "What's the trouble?" he inquired, the irritation he had felt the moment before giving his voice a touch of gruffness. "I've got to go out for a little while," she at last managed to reply. "Very well," he assented unwillingly. "But you can tell me what's the trouble with you, can't you? Where do you have to go?" I began Jennie, stammering. "I have—" "Yes," he said grimly. "I have to go on an errand," she stumbled on. "I can't wait. I'll tell you when I come back, Lester. Please don't ask me now." She looked vainly at him, her troubled countenance still marked by preoccupation and anxiety to get away, and Lester, who had never seen this look of intense responsibility in her before, was moved and irritated by it. "That's all right," he said. "But what's the use of all this secrecy? Why can't you come out and tell me what's the matter with you? What's the use of this whispering behind doors? Where do you have to go?" He paused, checked by his own harshness, and Jennie, who was intensely wrought up by the information she had received, as well as the unwonted verbal castigation she was now enduring, rose to an emotional state never reached by her before. "I will, Lester, I will," she exclaimed. "Only not now. I haven't time. I'll tell you everything when I come back. Please don't stop me now." She hurried to the adjoining chamber to get her wraps, and Lester, who had even yet no clear conception of what it all meant, followed her stubbornly to the door. "See here," he exclaimed in his vigorous, brutal way, "you're not acting right. What's the matter with you? I want to know." He stood in the doorway, his whole frame exhibiting the pugnacity and settled determination of a man who was bound to be obeyed. Jennie, troubled and driven to bay, turned at last. "It's my child, Lester," she exclaimed. "It's dying. I haven't time to talk. Oh, please don't stop me. I'll tell you everything when I come back." "Your child?" he exclaimed. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I couldn't help it," she returned. "I was afraid. I should have told you long ago. I meant to, only— Oh, let me go now, and I'll tell you all when I come back." He stared at her in amazement. Then he stepped aside, unwilling to force her any further for the present. "Well, go ahead," he said quietly. Don't you want someone to go along with you?" "No," she replied. "Mrs. Olsen is right here. I'll go with her." She hurried forth, white-faced, and he stood there pondering. Could this be the woman he had thought he knew? Why, she had been deceiving him for years. Jennie, the white-faced, the simple. He choked a little as he muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The reason why Jennie had been called out was nothing more than one of those infantile seizures, the coming and result of which no man can predict 2 hours beforehand. Vesta had been seriously taken with membranous croup only a few hours before, and the development since had been so rapid that the poor old Swedish mother was half frightened to death herself, and hastily dispatched a neighbor to say that Vesta was very ill, and Mrs. Kane was to come at once. This message, delivered as it was in a very nervous manner by one whose only object was to bring her, had induced the soul-racking fear of death in Jennie, and caused her to brave the discovery of Lester in the manner described. Jennie hurried on anxiously, her one thought being to reach her child before the arm of death could interfere and snatch it from her, her mind weighed upon by a legion of fears. What if it should already be too late when she got there? What if Vesta already should be no more? Instinctively she quickened her pace, and as the street lamps came and receded in the gloom, she forgot all the sting of Lester's words, all the fear that he might turn her out and leave her alone in a great city with a little child to care for, and remembered only the fact that her Vesta was very ill, possibly dying, and that she was the direct cause of the child's absence from her, that perhaps but for the want of her care and attention Vesta might be well tonight. "If I can only get there," she kept saying to herself, and then, with that frantic unreason which is the chief characteristic of the instinct-driven mother, "I might have known that God would punish me for my unnatural conduct. I might have known. I might have known." When she reached the gate, she fairly sped up the little walk and into the house, where Vesta was lying pale, quiet, and weak, but considerably better. Several Swedish neighbors and a middle-aged physician were in attendance, all of whom looked at her curiously as she dropped beside the child's bed and spoke to her. Jennie's mind had been made up. She had sinned, and sinned grievously, against her daughter, but now she would make amends as far as possible. Lester was very dear to her, but she would no longer attempt to deceive him in anything, even if he left her. She felt an agonized stab, a pain at the thought. She must still do the one right thing. Vesta must not be an outcast any longer. Her mother must give her a home. Where Jennie was, there must Vesta be. Sitting by the bedside in this humble Swedish cottage, Jennie realized the fruitlessness of her deception, the trouble and pain it had created in her home, the months of suffering it had given her with Lester, the agony it had heaped upon her this night, and to what end? The truth had been discovered anyhow. She sat there and meditated, not knowing what next was to happen, while Vesta quieted down, and then went soundly to sleep. Lester, after recovering from the first heavy import of this discovery, asked himself some perfectly natural questions. Who was the father of the child? How old was it? How did it chance to be in Chicago, and who was taking care of it? He could ask, but he could not answer. He knew absolutely nothing. Curiously now, as he thought, his first meeting with Jennie at Mrs. Bracebridge's came back to him. What was it about her that had attracted him? What made him think, after a few hours' observation, that he could seduce her to do his will? What was it? Moral looseness, or weakness, or what? There must have been art in the sorry affair, the practiced art of the cheat, and in deceiving such a confiding nature as his, she had done even more than practiced deception. She had been ungrateful. Now the quality of ingratitude was a very objectionable thing to Lester, the last and most offensive trait of a debased nature, and to be able to discover a trace of it in Jennie was very disturbing. It is true that she had not exhibited it in any other way before, quite to the contrary, but nevertheless he saw strong evidence of it now, and it made him very bitter in his feelings toward her. How could she be guilty of any such conduct toward him? Had he not picked her up out of nothing, so to speak, and befriended her? He moved from his chair in the silent room and began to pace slowly to and fro, the weightiness of this subject exercising to the full power of his decision. She was guilty of a misdeed which he felt able to condemn. The original concealment was evil, the continued deception more. Lastly, there was the thought that her love, after all, had been divided, part for him, part for the child, a discovery which no man in his position could contemplate with serenity. He moved irritably as he thought of it, shoved his hands in his pockets, and walked to and fro across the floor. That a man of Lester's temperament should consider himself wronged by Jennie merely because she had concealed a child whose existence was due to conduct no more irregular than was involved later in the yielding of herself to him, was an example of those inexplicable perversions of judgment to which the human mind, in its capacity of keeper of the honor of others, seems permanently committed. Lester, aside from his own personal conduct, for men seldom judge with that in the balance, had faith in the ideal that a woman should reveal herself completely to the one man with whom she is in love, and the fact that she had not done so was a grief to him. He had asked her once tentatively about her past. She begged him not to press her. That was the time she should have spoken of any child. Now he shook his head. His first impulse, after he had thought the thing over, was to walk out and leave her. At the same time, he was curious to hear the end of this business. He did put on his hat and coat, however, and went out, stopping at the first convenient saloon to get a drink. He took a car and went down to the club, strolling about the different rooms and chatting with several people whom he encountered. He was restless and irritated, and finally, after 3 hours of meditation, he took a cab and returned to his apartment. The distraught Jennie, sitting by her sleeping child, was at last made to realize by its peaceful breathing that all danger was over. There was nothing more that she could do for Vesta, and now the claims of the home that she had deserted began to reassert themselves. The promise to Lester and the need of being loyal to her duties until the very end. Lester might possibly be waiting for her. It was just probable that he wished to hear the remainder of her story before breaking with her entirely. Although anguished and frightened by the certainty, as she deemed it, of his forsaking her, she nevertheless felt that it was no more than she deserved, a just punishment for all her misdoings. When Jennie arrived at the flat, it was after 11, and the hall light was already out. She first tried the door and then inserted her key. No one stirred, however, and, opening the door, she entered into the expectation of seeing Lester sternly confronting her. He was not there, however. The burning gas had merely been an oversight on his part. She glanced quickly about, but seeing only the empty room, she came instantly to the other conclusion that he had forsaken her, and so stood there, a meditative helpless figure. Gone, she thought. At this moment his footsteps sounded on the stairs. He came in with his derby hat pulled low over his broad forehead, close to his sandy eyebrows, and with his overcoat buttoned up closely about his neck. He took off the coat without looking at Jennie and hung it on the rack. Then he deliberately took off his hat and hung that up also. When he was through, he turned to where she was watching him with wide eyes. "I want to know about this thing now, from beginning to end," he began. "Whose child is that?" Jennie wavered a moment, as one who might be going to take a leap in the dark, then opened her lips mechanically and confessed. "It's Senator Brander's." "Senator Brander?" echoed Lester, the familiar name of the dead but still famous statesman ringing with shocking and unexpected force in his ears. "How did you come to know him?" "We used to do his washing for him," she rejoined simply. "My mother and I." Lester paused, the baldness of the statement issuing from her sobering even his rancorous mood. Senator Brander's child, he thought to himself. So that great representative of the interests of the common people was the undoer of her, a self-confessed washerwoman's daughter. A fine tragedy of low life all this was. "How long ago was this?" he demanded, his face the picture of a darkening mood. "It's been nearly 6 years now," she returned. He calculated the time that had elapsed since he had known her, and then continued. "How old is the child?" "She's a little over 5." Lester moved a little. The need for serious thought made his tone more peremptory, but less bitter. "Where have you been keeping her all this time?" "She was at home until you went to Cincinnati last spring. I went down and brought her then." "Was she there the times I came to Cleveland?" "Yes," said Jennie, "but I didn't let her come out anywhere where you could see her." "I thought you said you told your people that you were married," he exclaimed, wondering how this relationship of the child to the family could have been adjusted. "I did," she replied, "but I didn't want to tell you about her. They thought all the time I intended to." "Well, why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I didn't know what was going to become of me when I went with you, Lester. I didn't want to do her any harm if I could help it. I was ashamed. Afterward, when you said you didn't like children, I was afraid." "Afraid I'd leave you?" "Yes." He stopped, the simplicity of her answers removing a part of the suspicion of artful duplicity which had originally weighed upon him. After all, there was not so much of that in it as mere wretchedness of circumstance and cowardice of morals. What a family she must have! What queer non-moral natures they must have to have brooked any such combination of affairs. "Didn't you know that you'd be found out in the long run?" he at last demanded. "Surely you might have seen that you couldn't raise her that way. Why didn't you tell me in the first place? I wouldn't have thought anything of it then." "I know," she said. "I wanted to protect her." "Where is she now?" he asked. Jennie explained. She stood there, the contradictory aspect of these questions and of his attitude puzzling even herself. She did try to explain them after a time, but all Lester could gain was that she had blundered along without any artifice at all, a condition that was so manifest that, had he been in any other position than he was, he might have pitied her. As it was, the revelation concerning Brander was hanging over him, and he finally returned to that. "You say your mother used to do washing for him. How did you come to get in with him?" Jennie, who until now had borne his questions with unmoving pain, winced at this. He was now encroaching upon the period that was by far the most distressing memory of her life. What he had just asked seemed to be a demand upon her to make everything clear.
"I was so young, Lester," she pleaded. "I was only 18. I didn't know. I used to go to the hotel where he was stopping and get his laundry, and at the end of the week I'd take it to him again." She paused, and as he took a chair, looking as if he expected to hear the whole story, she continued, "We were so poor. He used to give me money to give to my mother. I didn't know." She paused again, totally unable to go on, and he, seeing that it would be impossible for her to explain without prompting, took up his questioning again, eliciting by degrees the whole pitiful story. Brander had intended to marry her. He had written to her, but before he could come to her he died. The confession was complete. It was followed by a period of 5 minutes in which Lester said nothing at all. He put his arm on the mantel and stared at the wall while Jennie waited, not knowing what was to follow, not wishing to make a single plea. The clock ticked audibly. Lester's face betrayed no sign of either thought or feeling. He was now quite calm, quite sober, wondering what he should do. Jennie was before him as the criminal at the bar. He, the righteous, the moral, the pure of heart, was in the judgment seat. Now to sentence her, to make up his mind what course of action he should pursue. It was a disagreeable tangle, to be sure, something that a man of his position and wealth really ought not to have anything to do with. This child, the actuality of it, put an almost unbearable face upon the whole matter, and yet he was not quite prepared to speak. He turned after a time, the silvery tinkle of the French clock on the mantel striking 3, and causing him to become aware of Jennie, pale, uncertain, still standing as she had stood all this while. "Better go to bed," he said at last, and fell again to pondering this difficult problem. But Jennie continued to stand there wide-eyed, expectant, ready to hear at any moment his decision as to her fate. She waited in vain, however. After a long time of musing, he turned and went to the clothes rack near the door. "Better go to bed," he said indifferently. "I'm going out." She turned instinctively, feeling that even in this crisis there was some little service that she might render, but he did not see her. He went out, vouchsafing no further speech. She looked after him, and as his footsteps sounded on the stair, she felt as if she were doomed and hearing her own death knell. What had she done? What would he do now? She stood there, a dissonance of despair, and when the lower door clicked, moved her hand out of the agony of her suppressed hopelessness. Gone, she thought, gone. In the light of late dawn she was still sitting there pondering, her state far too urgent for idle tears. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The sullen, philosophic Lester was not so determined upon his future course of action as he appeared to be. Stern as was his mood, he did not see, after all, exactly what grounds he had for complaint. And yet the child's existence complicated matters considerably. He did not like to see the evidence of Jennie's previous misdeeds walking about in the shape of a human being, but as a matter of fact, he admitted to himself that long ago he might have forced Jennie's story out of her if he had gone about it in earnest. She would not have lied, he knew that. At the very outset he might have demanded the history of her past. He had not done so. Well, now it was too late. The one thing it did fix in his mind was that it would be useless to ever think of marrying her. It couldn't be done, not by a man in his position. The best solution of the problem was to make reasonable provision for Jennie and then leave her. He went to his hotel with his mind made up,
but he did not actually say to himself that he would do it at once. It is an easy thing for a man to theorize in a situation of this kind, quite another to act. Our comforts, appetites, and passions grow with usage, and Jennie was not only a comfort but an appetite with him. Almost 4 years of constant association had taught him so much about her and himself that he was not prepared to let go easily or quickly. It was too much of a wrench. He could think of it bustling about the work of a great organization during the daytime, but when night came it was a different matter. He could be lonely, too, he discovered, much to his surprise, and it disturbed him. One of the things that interested him in this situation was Jennie's early theory that the intermingling of Vesta with him and her in this new relationship would injure the child. Just how did she come by that feeling, he wanted to know. His place in the world was better than hers, yet it dawned on him after a time that there might have been something in her point of view. She did not know who he was or what he would do with her. He might leave her shortly. Being uncertain, she wished to protect her baby. That wasn't so bad. Then again, he was curious to know what the child was like. The daughter of a man like Senator Brander might be somewhat of an infant. He was a brilliant man, and Jennie was a charming woman. He thought of this, and while it irritated him, it aroused his curiosity. He ought to go back and see the child. He was really entitled to a view of it, but he hesitated because of his own attitude in the beginning. It seemed to him that he really ought to quit, and here he was parleying with himself. The truth was that he couldn't. These years of living with Jennie had made him curiously dependent upon her. Who had ever been so close to him before? His mother loved him, but her attitude toward him was not so much to do with real love as with ambition. His father, well, his father was a man like himself. All of his sisters were distinctly wrapped up in their own affairs. Robert and he were temperamentally uncongenial. With Jennie he had really been happy. He had truly lived. She was necessary to him. The longer he stayed away from her, the more he wanted her. He finally decided to have a straight-out talk with her, to arrive at some sort of understanding. She ought to get the child and take care of it. She must understand that he might eventually want to quit. She ought to be made to feel that a definite change had taken place, though no immediate break might occur. That same evening he went out to the apartment. Jennie heard him enter, and her heart began to flutter. Then she took her courage in both hands and went to meet him. "There's just one thing to be done about this as far as I can see," began Lester, with characteristic directness. "Get the child and bring her here where you can take care of her. There's no use leaving her in the hands of strangers." "I will, Lester," said Jennie submissively. "I always wanted to." "Very well, then. You'd better do it at once." He took an evening newspaper out of his pocket and strolled toward one of the front windows. Then he turned to her. "You and I might as well understand each other, Jennie," he went on. "I can see how this thing came about. It was a piece of foolishness on my part not to have asked you before and made you tell me. It was silly for you to conceal it, even if you didn't want the child's life mixed with mine. You might have known that it couldn't be done. That's neither here nor there, though, now. The thing that I want to point out is that one can't live and hold a relationship such as ours without confidence. You and I had that, I thought. I don't see my way clear to ever hold more than a tentative relationship with you on this basis. The thing is too tangled. There's too much cause for scandal." "I know," said Jennie. "Now, I don't propose to do anything hasty. For my part, I don't see why things can't go on about as they are, certainly for the present. But I want you to look the facts in the face." Jennie sighed. "I know, Lester," she said. "I know." He went to the window and stared out. There were some trees in the yard, where the darkness was settling. He wondered how this would really come out, for he liked a home atmosphere. Should he leave the apartment and go to his club? "You'd better get dinner," he suggested after a time, turning toward her irritably. But he did not feel so distant as he looked. It was a shame that life could not be more decently organized. He strolled back to his lounge, and Jennie went about her duties. She was thinking of Vesta, of her ungrateful attitude toward Lester, of his final decision never to marry her. So that was how one dream had been wrecked by folly. She spread the table, lighted the pretty silver candles, made his favorite biscuit, put a small leg of lamb in the oven to roast, and washed some lettuce leaves for a salad. She had been a diligent student of a cookbook for some time, and she had learned a good deal from her mother. All the time she was wondering how the situation would work out. He would leave her eventually, no doubt of that. He would go away and marry someone else. "Oh, well," she thought finally, "he is not going to leave me right away. That is something. And I can bring Vesta here." She sighed as she carried the things to the table. If life would only give her Lester and Vesta together! But that hope was over. End of chapter 30.